bill aims to stop the duopoly blocking actual or potential competitors. This bill could do that, but there are some parts that may not go far enough. The main point we wish to make is that there is a big difference between the definition of grocery products and retail grocery stores used in the bill and those used by supermarkets in their lease agreements. The definitions in the bill are reasonable, but the leases drafted by supermarket lawyers are not. So it's important to ensure, as you deliberate, that there are no loopholes. What's become apparent through our review of a generic retail lease is that supermarkets aren't using their market power to block just fellow grocery retailers. They're using it to block or constrain almost all retail that comes close to them. This is done by using incredibly broad definitions of what a supermarket is in leases that describe their sphere of interest. In summary, anything that can be sold. The best way to explain this is to direct you to page 3 of our submission, where we have published one supermarket chain's definition of a supermarket. It is an exhaustive list. The supermarket has defined its business as almost everything that can be sold by anybody. The supermarket can add any other goods at any time to future-proof opportunities or threats. All rights are reserved. Now, most New Zealanders would not think a supermarket is something that sells clothing, fashion, luggage, sports and fitness goods, appliances, shoes, computers, insurance and lending, hairdressing services, banking, arts and crafts, or childcare services. But according to this lease, they do. These sorts of definitions in some supermarket leases, given to landlords to sign, not the other way around, are written to provide maximum control and maximum veto power of all other retail near them. Because if a new tenant falls under the supermarket lease definition of a supermarket, then the landlord must get permission before they can allow them in, which I'm told is most often declined. In these leases, the power to veto all other retail that falls under the supermarket definition is big. If this committee gets its definitions in this bill right, you will increase competition, not just in grocery retail, but in all retail due to these incredibly broad definitions used to block others. You might even see a return to more mum and dad retail in malls and centres. There are other areas in these leases that are not reasonable. Supermarkets give themselves the extreme rights to determine things like who the landlord leases to up to 3 years after the supermarket has vacated the property. So the supermarket has packed up, terminated its lease, and for 3 years gets to have a say on who is on the landlord's land. Again, the strong powers of veto or delays has a major impact on a landlord's business and what's available to the community. But the clause that surprised us the most was the requirement for landlords to campaign to block potential supermarket competition. The lease we've quoted demands that the landlord makes submissions to oppose all district plans, developments, all new stores, all applications for resource consent or changes to a resource consent that affects the supermarket's competitive position and all at the landlord's own cost. All these sorts of oppressive clauses add up to barriers for new entrants. If this bill does prohibit the use of lease covenants, land covenants, and lease tactics to reduce competition and barriers to entry, then there is an opportunity not just for more grocery retail competition, but other forms of retailing as well. This committee has significant powers, and that's why we have suggested you might like to use those powers to request copies of additional leases from the supermarkets so that you can be further informed about the sorts of tactics being used to block others from competing within our duopoly market. Thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Andrew.
Hey, well, thank you, Catherine. I feel for the first time we're getting actually into the commercial nub of the issue. My first point, did the Commerce Commission, when it was doing its review, actually get into the level of detail you're talking about, all these different facets of leases? Did they really inquire of you? Did you provide a lot of information to them?
A lot of this lease information has only just come to hand.
But people have always known about these type of arrangements.
Yes, you are quite correct. But what the Commerce Commission did was put some numbers around a dirty secret that has currently, many people knew existed in the New Zealand market. We knew land banking and lease covenants and exclusivity of leases were being used to block new entrants, but no one really had an idea about the quantum. So the numbers in the Commission's report were very helpful and exposed what, as you say, many knew all along, but just didn't quite know how extensive it was. Because, of course, all these leases are confidential. Everything's confidential.
So the question we've already asked for advice of officials around these types of lease arrangements. And our response is, how do you know that all these leases are going to be captured? Because who's monitoring it? That's the first point. We're not quite sure who's going to be monitoring the situation. But secondly, the view is that Section 28, as it's currently drafted, would preclude these types of arrangements. Do you have any comfort that Section 28, as currently drafted in the bill, actually would get to that point?
It may do, because it says and all other provisions, and that's determined, and whether or not a landlord wants to use that and point to it when they're in negotiation will be up to that landlord. But you do have to think holistically, I think, about how you're going to reduce these barriers of entry, because it's not just an exclusive clause, it's a whole suite of clauses that is designed to block new entrants and make it incredibly difficult for a landlord to lease to anyone else.
So you mentioned that the supermarket's already trying to remove some of this. Do you think they're trying to remove one aspect of it, which is we won't stop you from allowing a competitor, but all the other ones, like on the sales turnover, which obviously incentivises landlords to keep them there, all those other aspects of the lease, do you think all those aspects will be removed? Or I suppose the question is, how do we know that?
Yes, and that's really my challenge to the Select Committee. I think in order to be informed, you need to have more physical leases in front of you so you can actually see what's going on in the market. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and most of these arrangements are confidential contracts. But you are right, there are lots of different ways to ensure that those barriers to entry remain. But if you get this right, then it should ensure that there are sites up and down New Zealand in malls that could be leased to other retailers, not just grocery retailers, but other butcheries, bakeries, pharmacies, salons. So
the argument of the Commerce Commission appears to be that if people became aware of these clauses, they're going to ring up someone and say, oh, there's a clause in place in this mall or this area in a small part of a town. First question, do you think that's an adequate way of actually exposing the sunlight, to use your expression, to find out whether all these arrangements have been captured and changed? Or do you see a role for the Commerce Commission to actually monitor this quite clearly and be much more proactive around it?
Yes, it could be a role for the Commerce Commission, and it will certainly be a role for the grocery regulator when that body is put in place. You're going to have to continue to scrutinise, because if you don't, you run the risk of the duopoly thinking that the scrutiny has gone and returning. And that's why it was important to prohibit and make these changes clear in law, not just rely on
last question. What is the potential for supermarkets to seek damages or compensation if they have to remove not the most obvious clauses like restricting competitors, but actually some of the other aspects? And you mentioned a whole stack of different types of clauses. If they have to remove all those, do you think there's a potential that supermarkets might seek compensation?
Well, history would tell us that they are litigious folk, but Parliament is the master of the law of this land. So if Parliament determines and changes the law, then that's that. But I think officials would be better to give you advice on that point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I read the submission and I just thank you. It was so fulsome and plenty of examples, so I really appreciate that. Got an education that the definition of supermarket actually included things like opticians, shoe repairs, dry cleaners, jewelers, hairdressers. It just seems ridiculous.
Who knew?
Who knew? I had no idea. I want to ask a question regarding the comment you made in your submission initially. You said supermarkets get to decide up to 3 years after they've vacated the premises who can be in the premises, the malls, I'm guessing. So how is that? And does that relate to number 10 of your submission, which talks about how they have the veto right and effectively reduce their rent by 50% and potentially not have the rent review for another 3 years? Is that what you're talking about, or is that a separate thing?
Yes, that's separate and complementary. If a landlord goes to lease their property to one of the categories that falls under that supermarket definition, or in fact a butcher, a baker, a florist, a pharmacy, or a salon without permission, then the supermarket can impose a penalty. They can pay half their rent up until the situation is remedied, which is the store in question is shut down. But your question relates to what I, as a layperson, viewed was a very extreme right. Usually if anybody else in the market leases something, terminates the lease and leaves, no one expects to be able to have a say on who's going to have the property after you. And what landlords have said to me is that makes it incredibly difficult to lease the property to another supermarket or any other food distributor, because you have to go back to the original supermarket tenant that may have been gone from the property for 2 3/4 years to say, we'd like to lease to this new tenant. What do you think? And of course, they can take their time. There are delays. And once again, it's another barrier to entry. I mean, I'm very positive that if landlords start to say, look, these provisions are now unenforceable, we are going to lease our properties to whomever we choose, you will have an opportunity for an Aldi or small format stores to be able to go into centres up and down New Zealand. Because if you actually look what's happened to our malls, which should be community hubs, you've lost a lot of those mum and dad stores that were part of the social interaction, social fabric. I used to think it was because they left because of competition. I now realise they've left because probably the supermarkets declined their tenancy.
Is it actually listed as part of the exclusivity covenant that they have the right for up to 3 years after they vacate?
Yes, that was.
So this bill will actually fix that.
Well, you could argue that that's one of the provisions that's blocking.
You don't think it
that's
does?
blocking a barrier to entry. But I suppose my challenge to you is to look at this information and for you to test that is it covered or not. And officials may not have seen these sorts of lease provisions before. Officials were probably reasonable people and they've drafted reasonable clauses. But a lot of the supermarket leases I've seen are not reasonable. They're oppressive. And there is a market power for them to be able to make these demands.
So just to be clear, the reason the supermarkets put all these extra things in there like shoes, hardware, etc., financial services, banking, not necessarily because they're actually doing them at the moment, but because they may want to do them in the future. Is that correct?
They're saying, well, it's a way of controlling who else is around you, but also it's a way of ensuring that you have maximum control of what the market opportunity is. It's like I'm not in this area now, but I want to preserve my right to get into it. And really, if you're looking at, you can only get a clause like that through if you have maximum power and dominance. If it's a normal lease arrangement, I mean, imagine if you were renting a property or an apartment and you turned up and gave the landlord your lease and said, here are all my additional clauses that say go away. With such power and with the duopolistic market structure, people who deal with them don't have that ability, so they can get away with these sorts of oppressive clauses.
And just another question, have you, I can't see it in here, but just in terms of some suggested legislation or, some suggested wording, for the Act, have you gone to that level or not?
Well, sadly, I'm not a lawyer. If I had my career over again, I'd go down that route. I'm sure.
With counsel.
Parliament, your drafters and officials
that's
should be able to. I suppose our main message is that it's not just a single exclusivity clause, it's a suite of oppressive clauses that have the same effect. And in particular, you should certainly prohibit the ability for a supermarket to tell a landlord or anybody to go out and campaign against new developments, new district plans, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I found that very interesting.
Most New Zealanders would think that's neither fair nor reasonable.
We're pretty much at time. Were there any other very quick questions? No, I was going to explore the campaign aspect as well. We obviously haven't got time, but yeah, it's quite startling.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Next up, we have the National Maori Authority. Taki. Welcome, Matthew.
Welcome, kia ora.
Kia
All
ora.
good?
Kia ora.
Yeah,
Good to see you finally in Roosters.
it's nice to have that face-to-face in person.
Well, morning, my name is Matthew Tukaki for the record, Chairman of the National Māori Authority. The National Māori Authority represents just over 440 odd members from social services backgrounds, Māori small business, medium-sized enterprise and so on and so forth, everything from honey growers to fishery operators and social service organisations as well. You might find it strange that the National Māori Authority has stepped into this debate about groceries. I mean, what the heck would we know? Well, let me tell you what we know. We own 50% of fishing quota as Te Ao Māori in New Zealand. That is a multi-billion-dollar industry in itself. We have 40, 30, 20, 10% of beef, dairy, lamb, and also kiwi fruit. We have cornered the market when it comes to Manuka honey, and we are one of the largest suppliers of primary produce directly to these large operators and the shelves of supermarkets right across the country. The Māori economy, with an estimation of between $60 and $70 billion per annum. Wouldn't it be great if we had another market operator in this country that also had iwi interests involved, because that would really bring it home for our people. But let me talk about a couple of things, if you don't mind, really just to total everything Catherine has said. And it's been a pleasure working on occasion with Catherine and the team at the Feed and Grocery Council, because she really does know her stuff when it comes to this market. For the purposes of this particular piece of legislation, first of all, I'd say I'm confident that Section 28 is in the right direction. I'm confident that we will be able to draw a line under these complexities of leases and covenants, and also the land banking that's been going on over many years. But it's important to understand the reason why this legislation is so important is because we have tried leaving it up to the market operators to do the right thing, and quite clearly they haven't been doing the right thing. So it's really important that we do this. I do think there is a next step in terms of oversight to also speak to some of Catherine's concerns. Additional oversight about the implementation of the legislation, further important monitoring of covenants, leases and commercial leasing agreements moving forward. Now, I'm not aware of any advice that's come through from officials yet on the work that they've done around how that might be monitored, but as we move forward to the Grocery Code of Conduct and et cetera, I'm sure more work will be done. I also just want to pick up on a couple of really important points and refocus our attention on the behaviour of some of these market operators around these leasing agreements. Catherine is absolutely right to suggest that it's not about what's going on now with these covenants and leasing agreements and all the myriad of things that they've got in there. I think nail polish operators are in there as well on the off chance. I'm surprised, quite frankly, they haven't added funeral directors in, but anyway, cut by. Coppin's going to a supermarket near you soon. But the point I'm trying to make is it's not about the business model today, it's about their future anticipated business models. And if you have a look at the behavioural countdown owned by Woolworths in Australia, and what Woolworths and the big market operators have been doing in Australia in that market, you will see a forward march into other industries and other retail sort of stock and trades that we're starting to see emerge here in New Zealand right now. I'll use pharmacies as an example. For the countdown on Key Street, we've already now an internal pharmacy opened up where you can now go and get your prescription medications. It's not any longer just the case of getting your meat from the butcher or the deli, of getting your fresh food and vegetables from that aisle or the booze from the other aisle. Now you can also get your prescription medications. The business model from Australia also is predicated on selling everything from life insurance to pet insurance, credit cards and banking services. We are talking about a group of supermarket operators in this country that have the potential, if they remain unencumbered and effective regulation and good competition policy, that we're going to see them slowly but surely encroach into those other markets and those other retail networks that would otherwise make up Main Street New Zealand. Also of concern for us has been the predatory behaviour of the market operators, and picking up one of the questions before that I'm sure you wanted to explore about the campaigns that they drive out there. Sometimes they're subtle, sometimes it involves a significant amount of investment in lobbying. Even in the Commerce Commission process during the stage of the food and grocery inquiry, they managed to OIA all of the submissions from the Maori submitters, which I felt was quite offensive. All you had to do was really turn up and listen to what we were saying or engage with us before these submissions were made. The challenge of that is an example of both predatory and also intimidatory behaviour. And wrapped up within these covenants, wrapped up within these leases, and wrapped up within these commercial agreements, you also find that behaviour. Whether it's intimidating landlords, whether it's intimidating other market operators from not being able to become established themselves, or whether it's about putting pressure on, say, for example, landlords not to allow smaller business or retail operators to exist. Another classic example is the local sushi shop. Love sushi, but if you noticed at Countdown down here on Lambton Quay, we've now got a sushi shop within a metro store. Now, I would argue very, very strongly that what you want to do is closely interrogate the full list and gambit of things that are excluded through these lease agreements that prohibit small business operators from starting up. Because in my mind, whether you be Māori or New Zealanders or whomever, it's our right as entrepreneurial folk to have a crack at something and not be encumbered by two very sophisticated campaign-driven market operators. The other point I wanted to make just about this legislation, and I'll come back to something I mentioned before, it's going to come down to enforceability. It's going to come down to ensuring that whatever is put in place, there is not a loophole found to enable these market operators to change tax slightly, and then all of a sudden we see a new sophistication in terms of the commercial leasing agreements that are out there. And I think this is where the monitoring and oversight aspect of the legislation needs to come into play. But failing all of that, took everything that the Food and Grocery Council had said, and you've got a copy of our submission. I think we've also been supplied, hopefully, with our submission to the Commerce Commission, which was extensive. That also included the next step elements of the reforms, including the Grocery Code of Conduct. Happy to speak to it and happy to take any questions.
First and then Andrew.
Well, playing devil's advocate, thank you so much for your submission. I probably agree with everything you've actually said. Playing devil's advocate, what's wrong with a supermarket wanting to diversify and provide businesses or services that can potentially be a one-stop shop for consumers who actually go to the supermarket to get their groceries as well as the pharmacy products and everything else that you're potentially saying that they could provide?
Well, first of all, in a Western-based economy, that is the opposite to effective market competition. What we're agreeing, if I agree with that, we're agreeing that we should only have a couple of operators and everybody should be trained to go to that single operator and convince them it's a one-stop shop. That's not how our economy works. It's not how our economy was built. Our economy was built on the backbone of small and medium-sized enterprise, mum and dad shops out on Main Street, the butcher, the deli, the candlestick maker. And if we were to accept that model moving forward is to exclude all of them, we're then excluding the entrepreneurial spirit of our country. And that doesn't fit well with me at all. But what I would also say is that we accept that those market operators are right. Let's just consider for a moment all the other things that we've discovered during this process. The fact that they put immense amount of pressure and intimidatory tactics on suppliers and small producers. Another example is when the Commerce Commission stepped up and allowed the metadata from the website to be shown, metadata on their website to be made public. And then we saw potentially the risk of those small operators and suppliers who had made submissions all of a sudden come under risk of having their contracts cancelled. At any time that sort of predatory behaviour exists in this country, it's not so obvious for the layperson to see it, but we're seeing it now. So I would say that's not in the spirit of New Zealand, and it's not in the spirit of good, effective competition.
Okay, hey, thank you, Matthew. Very helpful. Two questions. The first question, I'm a little bit surprised you talked about predatory pricing and all those other issues, and obviously what Catherine's talking about, the nature of lease agreements which are formalised. Why, but you said at the outset, you were confident that Section 28 will do the job. Why, given what you've just been speaking about, why are you so confident that Section 28 as it's currently drafted will make sure that we don't see continuation of these practices?
So let me just clarify. I'm confident that Section 28 may work, providing there is that oversight. I keep coming back to what the oversight is going to look like. How is this legislation going to be implemented? What is the test that's going to be applied to ensure that whatever commercial or leasing agreements that the market operators end up coming up with don't fall in between some sort of loophole that they find in the legislation. So that's that, and that's going to come down to really good, tidy drafting. I'm not always confident that legislation gets drafted in a tidy way. It tends to create more loopholes that we have to clean up in 20 years' time and say, oh, we need to reduce the red tape. So I'm confident on that aspect of it, providing there's good oversight.
Okay, well, that was my second question. And it was the same question I put to Catherine. Because my personal concern is these leases, we just hope that voluntarily everything's going to be cleaned up. But is it all going to be cleaned up and all the clauses going to be cleaned up? The question to you is, who do you think, if we were to have a monitoring agency, who do you think's best placed? The grocery commissioner who's going to be appointed, but we don't quite know what the arrangements are, those people are, or the Commerce Commission? Who do you think's the best jurisdiction to oversee that?
Well, the easy answer to that is whoever has the statutory power.
Well, we can create that, though.
Yeah,
it depends where we send it.
Yeah. So at the moment, one would think that the Commerce Commission would have some sort of statutory authority or power. It's questionable as to whether they're not, which is why the legislation needs to be put in place. Whether or not the market regulator or monitor or whatever it's going to be called is that organisation, we're yet to see, because we don't know what that's going to look like necessarily until the government publishes whatever models are under consideration. So I can't really answer that question other than to say, if you were to ask me a different way, do I trust the Commerce Commission in its current state and role to be that arbiter? I would say no.
Okay, that's good. And do you want me to ask you why?
Yes, well, thank you. We didn't need to be here. If we had effective competition and a regulatory environment and good effective policy in this country going back many decades, we didn't need to be in a position where we were confronted with having to clean up the mess that is a duopoly. And I would also suggest that the way that the Commerce Commission handled this inquiry, this review, was laissez-faire at best, and quite frankly, left wanting. And I'll give you the classic example. It shouldn't have had to have been the case that the National Māori Authority had to barge its way in to be heard. We are a significant STL Māori, and I don't represent all Māori, right? I just represent a cluster and a small group. I'd probably be nicked if I claimed that right. But here's the thing. We are a significant player in the New Zealand economy, and I've outlined the numbers before. 50% of fishing quota, 40, 30, 20, 10% kiwi fruit, beef, lamb and dairy in this country. We're also the backbone of the labour workforce when it comes to the wholesale and distribution network, and we're a pretty good market operator ourselves when it comes to primary produce and supply. Forgive me for saying this, but it was unforgivable that we were some sort of afterthought just because, let's just go and talk to them about the treaty, eh? Let's go and have a talk to them about fertility and how we might want to embed something into the future. No, enough. We are significant players in the New Zealand economy, and we deserve to have our voices heard, because at the end of the day, if we get all of these models right in terms of Māori and creating both that aspiration and translating that into wealth for our people, can you imagine what we could achieve in reducing poverty?
We've got one minute left. I'm just interested, from a philosophical point of view, possibly a practical point of view. We currently have the duopoly, which is around a couple of hundred supermarkets across New Zealand. Legislation like this and other legislation that's been foreshadowed, will bring more competition to the market. That's the intention of, obviously. How many more players do we need in the market, though, to actually impact? Because, it's one thing to have another sort of 10 stores pop up here and there across the country. in terms of getting that balance
Yep.
in terms of competition. Yeah.
All right, Costco is not the answer, right? Costco is a great example of somebody coming into the market that might grab some headlines, but they will be an Auckland-based market operator. It'll be great for Auckland, or parts of Auckland, and so on and so forth. But I can't imagine Costco is going to expand into Tauranga or whatever. So it can't just be a one-hit, one-play wonder. And there are a range of other dynamics around this. So, for example, I'm encouraged by the Warehouse Group stepping into the market again. You would have seen the advertising on the TV where they've gone from selling pillows and blankets to pasta and milk. If you go into most of their larger warehouses, the one at Westgate, for example, is a really good one. You'll see more shelf space dedicated to food, packaged goods and consumables. However, the Warehouse Group stepping into the market is only there because they're the ones with the distribution and wholesale network. More work needs to be done to encourage them to go a little bit further. Could they be the third operator? Potentially. A fourth operator coming in from overseas also has great appeal, but we as a country need to attract that investment in by opening up the doors and allowing competition policy to flow a little bit more freely to create the environment. That's why I'm so confident in the government's approach at the moment and quite pleased with the way that David Clark has pushed back on the Commerce Commission. But the other aspect of it, we need to go a little bit further in freeing up some of those regional stores, particularly things like the Foursquare brand and also Fresh Choice. I would like to see those assets divested into other hands to create more networks of suppliers and shelf space for other suppliers not restricted to home brands and the largest operators. So it's a little bit more complex. I think if people think that a market operator is going to turn up on the door and knock on that door and Kapai are all going to be ready to go on Monday, that'd be me lying to you, convincing you that a unicorn just passed through that window, crapping a rainbow out its backside. So this is going to take time for a market operator to emerge. But coming back to one last point I would make on that, and that is, are we going to see the pressures on cost of living and food in your basket or your trolley start to reduce? We probably will, because the supermarket operators have got the message. However, does it go far enough? Considering that they're earning in excess of $1 million a day in profits, which is pretty good, that tells me that there's more fat. And I think New Zealanders are over the duopoly, and that's why we want that competition. But it's going to take time.
Thank you. Appreciate your submission.
Kia ora.
Thanks, Matthew. Kia ora. Members, next up we have Dairy and Business Owners Group, Sunny Kushal. Zoom, yeah, I thought so. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Oh, I could.
Sunny, welcome. Hello,
You're muted.
You're on mute there, buddy. Great.
Kia ora koutou, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, kia ora. Welcome to the committee. Thank you for taking time for your submission. We have up to 15 minutes for your submission. So if you'd like to, we have your written submission. If you'd like to make some opening comments, and then I'm sure members will have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Today I will put my submission for 10 minutes, and after that I would be happy to take questions and interact with the members. So I'm Sunny Kaushal. I'm the chair of the Dairy and Business Owners Group. We represent nearly 4,900 businesses in New Zealand, from Kataya up to Bluff. So I wish to present our dairy convenience sector as the third player. Nielsen industry data from 2021 scopes the grocery market at $18.4 billion. That includes supermarkets, $15 billion, which is 82% market share. The convenience sector, which is $3.4 billion, that's 18% of the market share. So our convenience sector includes the petrol convenience, such as Z Express, Corner Dairies, and banner convenience like Foursquare. And now what works and what won't to lower prices is potential entrants don't want for money to enter New Zealand. Walmart has revenues of US $572 billion, which is more than twice our country's GDP. And Aldi in 2021 had revenues of US $134 billion. So you don't need A1 sites either. So Russian super discounter Maori, which has been rightly sanctioned, however, showed in Europe that people will travel for bargains. It undercuts Aldi and a little by 20%. Land covenants and breakup of stores will not make prices cheaper. We want cheaper goods, but the only way to do this is the forced divestment of supermarket, warehouses, and distribution centers. So this forces the warehouses, distribution centers to compete for retail shelf space that could be a dairy, a countdown, or a service station. This creates supplier opportunities and spurs lower prices because the retailer has choice. It also opens up dairy supply by suppliers too. So by warehouses, we include Gilmore's and Trent's, but refer specifically to the dry groceries distribution centers, fresh produce distribution centers, chilled and frozen distribution centers, as well as meat and seafood processing in both islands. This is why we asked this committee to conduct the following inquiry that we believe would assist Dr. David Clark going forward. So inquire into both A, designated grocery retailer warehousing or distribution, assessing forced divestment into at least 3 competing groups, and 2, designated grocery retailer vertical integration, that is manufacturing and home brands, as well as horizontal integration, which is meat, fisheries, and alcohol brands. A specific bill recommendation for suppliers that could lower prices is in our submission. We recommend the interpretation be amended to define supplier. We also recommend new subsections to be added to Section 36 of the Act to ensure suppliers are treated equitably and no counter-designated grocery retailer power. And two counter-designation grocery retailer power. Since we submitted on Friday last week, the minister has announced a code of conduct. This should be legislated for. The committee need to understand that there are fees that took a lot like letting fee. It looks like a lot of a letting fee being charged to suppliers to access warehouses and distribution centers. This act like a tax on suppliers that goes suppliers and consumers alike and lessens our ability to be competitive. And you know what? They call it cost of serve, but it is a toll on suppliers, hiding up a brand accounting term. Now, foodstuffs, we are told, charges up to 3%, and Woolworths New Zealand less, but this is telling. And Woolies only charge its franchise stores, not countdown. So Foodies charges all of its retailers. So retailers grocery designation grocery retailer distribution centers get a free margin of up to 3% from suppliers. NB says this loss of margin may be made up for by retailers on other lines sold to consumers. So up to 3% may not sound like much, but it is a huge haircut for suppliers running thin margins. Especially, the duopoly uses this to support their home brands. For suppliers and consumers alike, the designated grocery retailer house always wins. We urge the committee to take a leaf from the Hungarian Competition Authority and enact our recommendations into Commerce Act. The Hungarian Spa supermarket decision being about the very thing happening here. Now, localism and dairies are the as the third the player. Our sector is the third player and could disrupt supermarkets by resurrecting local shopping centers, yet we are treated like an afterthought. Dairies are only for COVID, it feels like. Impending charges to smoke-free law could reduce outlets from 6,000 outlets to 500. This would be devastating, which is why proper reform of this sector is needed with this legislation. An OIA from the Ministry of Health, which we had put earlier, tells us 94% of outlets fully complied with smoke-free laws over the past 2 years. We already face a black market that customs in other OIA estimates to be worth at least $92 million, which is 6%. But Ash says could be as high as $160 million, which is 10% GST is on top. So we need a competitive wholesale and distribution environment to survive long term. But if you wish to make a difference in the short term, you should recommend to your colleagues on the health committee to, number one, ban cigarette sales in supermarket, but retain them in existing stores where the owners have been compliant over the previous 24 months. And two, allow dairies to promote vaping products to smokers where they come in to buy cigarettes. Nothing that we are limited to selling mint, menthol, and tobacco vaping flavors only. Now, if we could sell price
Sunny,
essentials, yeah, I'm going forward. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry to interrupt you. You've had about 10 minutes, about 5 minutes left. Did you want to maybe quickly wrap up? Because I know there will be some questions.
I'm getting to the final. So if we could sell price competitive essentials, dairies become the anchor for greengrocers, butchers, bakers, and delicatessens to come back to local shopping centers. This is also good for emissions, Mr. Chair, because it is wholly inconsistent for us to lose on street car parks while it fill your boots for the supermarkets. And the final point that I want to make is look at it like this. If 88% of Kiwi households currently drive 6 kilometers in a weekly roundup to a supermarket, then that generates 540 million annual kilometers. That means this generates 125,000 tons of carbon dioxide, costing shoppers over 150 million in fuel. Happy to answer questions.
All right.
Good point, Andrew.
You all right? Hey, first of all, Sunny, just acknowledge you and what you do for the dairy owners industry, and particularly with your very difficult time you're having at the moment with ram raids. So just acknowledge you for that.
Thank you, Andrew.
Very good submission. Just want to ask you technical stuff. You come up with some specific wording around the definition of supplier, and I realise a lot of your members will be going to a Pack and Save, as an example, buying them produce from them and then taking it and selling in their store and having to mark up to make a living from that process. Your reason for describing dairies, which I think is the purpose of your clause in 19 of your submission, is you're not really a supplier, but you want to be captured by the new rules that have been proposed that suppliers must be given proper treatment and not subject to undue practices. Is that the intent of what you're trying to do with that particular clause, even though you're not technically a supplier, but you want to be captured by the same provisions that will be hopefully imposed on supply arrangements so they're not disadvantaged unduly?
Thank you for your question. Look, as I said, we have nearly 4,900 outlets New Zealand wide, which is and it covers even the remotest areas, the rural areas. So what we are projecting here is, and then also presenting, is our dairy convenience sector is to be the third player in the given situation when we are talking about the reforms, and that's how So lower prices basically start there and not where how many stores like those Woolies and foodies have. So that's what we are suggesting. The MYEI and the ministerial time be better spent looking at forced divestment through warehousing and distribution into at least 3 competing groups, and we are one of them.
Just a supplementary, Sunny. I guess my understanding of what you were actually saying was that the dairy industry sectors, the small groceries, corner dairies and such, rely on wholesalers like Gilmore's and Trent's in the South Island, and they're owned by foodstuffs. And so effectively, the designated grocery sector, as in the Woolworths and the New Worlds, basically control the price that their competitors, as in the local corner dairies, actually have to pay to get their supply. Are you wanting something done to prevent that supply sector being controlled as well, is what I'm saying?
That's correct, Melissa. Look, the basic thing here is that the distribution and wholesale, that need to be separated. That need to be differentiated. So here you have a duopoly, which of course got the wholesale, the distribution, and then the retail. And then many times the dairies are buying, say, goods from Gilmore. But if they're buying it from, say, one of their other stores, it gets cheaper. So it doesn't make any sense to go to the wholesaler, whereas the retailers are selling cheaper. So something is not matching here. So we need to look at the reforms. We need to compete for the shelf space.
And just very quickly on that, I know the government are currently exploring the potential for further changes. Was that recommendation part of the Commerce Commission report in terms of the wholesalers and distribution centres, separating it out?
Yeah,
I remember.
Yeah, the Commerce Commission report, as you have seen, is still has not answered the questions. Of course, coming up with the code of conduct, that's one good thing. But here, to create the competitive environment and to have those lowering the prices passed on to the consumer, I think these are the serious things that we need to do. That includes, as I said, even the 3%, which is like a letting fee, is being charged on suppliers by these duopoly warehouses.
Yeah, it's a bit of work to do. Okay, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sunny.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Monopoly Watch, NZ, Tex Edwards, who will be joining us online. Some of you will also know Tex is the founder of 2 Degrees. Welcome, Tex. Hello.
Welcome. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, gotcha. Yep. Hey, look, on behalf of the committee, thanks for taking the time to submit. We have up to 15 minutes for your submission. So, some time, for some comments from you, but I'm sure there'll be a number of questions. So if you could leave some time, that'd be great. Thank you.
Please excuse if I talk like a horse racing commentator. I'll quickly make a few opening comments and then listen to questions. Monopoly Watch are financial analysts. We study market structure and we benchmark against other countries that look like New Zealand. So we benchmark against Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway. Parliamentary MPs run New Zealand. supermarkets don't. I'm sure you know that, but it's a healthy thing to remind everybody of. New Zealand is globally famous for weak competition law. It's been catalogued in the Oxford Press as widely been a disaster. It's outside the context of this committee, but we could pick up just how weak competition law in New Zealand has been for 30 years, some of the time. We've studied in detail and answered the Commerce Commission question in a series of submissions to the Commerce Commission about what will it take to create scalable, like-for-like competition, not pocket competition, not bespoke competition, not Gucci and Prada competition, but like-for-like, nationwide, scalable competition. We've answered that question in our submissions to the Commission. And I just alert the committee to that New Zealand has an awful history in committees like this of taking 15 years to solve problems that most of the OECD fixed in 15 months, notably in telecommunications, notably in fuel markets, and notably in electricity markets. So there is some pressure here to act with speed. And we compliment Minister Clark and Deputy Minister Robinson on pushing back on the Commerce Commission report and cataloguing the fact that they're instructing MB to look at unbundling the supermarket and analysing what it would take to do divestments. Too often we're defeatist in New Zealand. We're taught to be defeatist about competition issues because we're dominated by large companies. What the work that the Select Committee is doing right this moment was done by the ACCC 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, Woolworths Australia, that have perpetuated these anti-competitive covenants on Kiwis, they were banned by their own government from doing it 15 years ago. Who's asked the question of what impact it's had on the ESG rating of Woolworths? The horse is bolted on this matter, and it's really important that we understand that the entrenchment of the duopoly means that the regulatory prescription to fix the problem before this committee is not just unhooking the covenants. Yes, unhooking the covenants is a great step forward. Yes, I agree with Sunny on some matters. Yes, I agree with Catherine Rich on smaller players and competition. And Matthew Tutaki made some very good comments that I support. However, I urge the committee to fertilise themselves to get ready for more regulatory action to create like-for-like competition. It's market power that is the problem, not covenants. When the committee's at the pub this evening discussing this bill, please catalogue in your minds what is scale and what is like-for-like competition. The unhooking of the covenants is actually there's an unintended consequence here because it'll actually lower rental costs for supermarkets. And actually, there's been a lot of publicity about the $1 million a day of what Monopoly Watch would call monopoly rents, which is excess profitability. But that excess profitability increases because the duopoly / geographic monopolies of supermarkets today shares its superior profitability with landlords and property owners. And so they're financially incentivized to put these covenants in place. That's noteworthy. And I just share with my other colleagues listening to previous submissions this morning, 2 seconds, Section 28 and Section 36 of the Commerce Act, we need more prescriptive detail. We need a definition of what significant market power is. And we urge all sides of this committee to encourage the Commission to run more competition cases. New Zealand's run 5 big competition cases in 20 years. Most countries run 20 competition cases a year. That would have helped resolve this. And I don't think there's anything that the committee should do today in unhooking these covenants that would preclude the Commission from running substantial litigation against the supermarkets who perpetuated this anti-competitive behaviour, in particular, how they quarantined the warehouse, buying 20% of its stock and putting it in a no supply situation. I think that's noteworthy because litigation should be considered here. We agree with the Food and Grocery Council on the suite of competitors in terms of the importance of the butcher, bakery, delicatessen, what have you, around a supermarket. And we ask that officials check the wording on that. No one voted no one voted for a 3-2 merger where New Zealand went from having 3 supermarket operators in 2005 to 2 operators in 2006. Nobody voted for that. That's the root of the problem. Thanks for listening to Monopoly Watch. I look forward to listening to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tex. We'll start with Andrew.
Hey, thanks, Tex. So first, a general question. So the government's announced that obviously we're going to put through this legislation, and we'll ask about details of that in a minute, whether it's going to have much effect, but also the establishment of a regulator and some other changes that everyone's well known. Just as a general point, how much gain do you think this will leading to lower prices for mum and dad every time they go to the supermarket on the weekend? Do you think it will have a reasonable change, significant change, and do you think it will be lasting?
That's pertaining to these covenants or other initiatives that have been mentioned?
The other initiatives that have been announced.
Oh, I think that if the government pursues the divestment option.
No, I'm just talking about the existing one. They've been talking. The Commerce Commission obviously came up with the idea to have a grocery oversight body yet to be established. Don't know about the terms of reference yet. Obviously, doing the legislation around this and a couple of other changes which look like are going to be implemented. Without moving into divest and requiring supermarkets to divest, do you think those changes in themselves, which have been recommended and look like they're going to be approved, will lead to a significant change or just marginal change? And will it be lasting?
This is a bottle. There's 2 parts of the bottle. Let's cut off this side of the bottle, and that's a bottle. That's a consumer-facing side. That's a supplier-facing side. The problem with the Commerce Commission report is that it had too much attention on this side of the bottleneck. Okay, and we had the same discussion in the Commerce Commission inquiry. To your point, Andrew Bailey, and thank you for the question, is it's not going to have a substantive effect until you resolve this side of the bottleneck and this side. Here are suppliers on this side of the bottle, and here are consumers on this side of the bottle. And we need market attention and regulatory prescription to fix this broken market on both sides of the bottle. So to answer your question, I don't know if the committee can see the example, but does that make sense?
Yeah, so just to sort of another way. So what you're saying, there's been a lot of focus on the supplier arrangements and obviously supplier getting rid of undue practices with supplier and rebates and all that sort of stuff. Hopefully that'll be the role of the new grocery oversight board or whatever it might be. Covenant's another one, but you're suggesting if you don't focus on the retail, all you're going to do is maybe grocery chains will end up probably paying more to their suppliers or not whacking them with costs. But if they've got the same profit margins, then mum and dads going to the supermarket on the weekend are going to end up possibly paying higher prices?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Bailey. That's 100%. That's in our submission. We agree with you. Yes, the pressure on this committee and the pressure on the ComCom and the MB inquiry is to fix both ends of the bottleneck. And I think you've eloquently languaged the discussion that all the activity is on the supplier side of the bottle neck, not the consumer side. You need to unpin the monopolistic, which we call geographic monopolies of the supermarkets at the retail side. You need to break retail power. That's why the supermarkets are gaming this committee, and that's why when we hear from Woolworths and Foodstuffs today, they'll want to confuse and praise the Lord that you take the covenants away and suddenly Aldi is going to come in and do 100 stores, or we're all going to go to heaven, or Costco are going to come for 100 stores. That isn't the case. And you've nicely languaged that you can't just sort out the suppliers to sort out the supermarket industry. You have to break the paradigm of market power at the retail end. That's why we need 100 store divestment.
Okay, so Tex, I'm hoping you will go to heaven, but moving on. So you strongly urge that supermarkets should be deemed to have significant market power.
Yeah.
What is the significance? And you talk about 25%. What's the significance of that definition?
So thank you for asking that. The issue is it's something we've also submitted on, and we submitted on it vigorously in telecommunications because it gives the opportunity for the Commission to work faster and smoother, and it enables politicians on all sides of the table to understand who has market power and who doesn't have market power. And most regulatory public policy environments globally, particularly in competition, have what we call asymmetric behaviours. So if you have market power, you can't do something that if you didn't have market power. And so the small butcher and baker can participate in a competitive behaviour that a large gorilla supermarket who has 40% market share can't do. And the moment that you define who has SMP and who doesn't have SMP, it enables the New Zealand competition law framework to become more synergistic with international jurisdictions such as Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions? Tex, just a quick question from me. Harking back to the submission we heard from the Food and Grocery Council, in terms of how broad these covenants are, they don't just include groceries. They include shoes, they include, banking services, etc. Do you have any advice for the committee around how the legislation captures the breadth of those covenants?
No, thank you for that. That's a really potent question because it reminded me of when I read the 220 pages of the Woolworths annual report. Woolworths is an Australian operator. It has 42% market share in Australia. And their documented strategy to their investors is actually because they've got Aldi and they've got the ACCC beating up the duopoly in Australia, because they call it a duopoly in Australia. It's 40% Coles, 42% Woolworths, then there's Aldi and Metcash. It's still very much a duopoly in Australia. But Woolworths, thanks for the question, Jamie. Woolworths in Australia document that they're going to expand their product range. And so they actually talk about expanding the product range. So their market share capture, right, is still 42%, or they can pretend they're going to 39% and give Aldi some more market share to camouflage their dominance. And they actually state in their investor pack that they're going after these other segments. And so using the market power and the leverage, but particularly the consumer data that they capture through their AI cameras, that when you become a member of one of their frequent flyer programs inside the supermarket, those one card things, that they're taking pictures of you, understanding your consumer behavior, and then they're going to absolutely sell you a toaster, your kids some clothes, some Thomas the Tank Engine stuff for your kids, and broaden it. And so to your point, absolutely, please give official guidance that that broadening of scope of a supermarket is quarantined in the anti-competitive covenant behaviours. Thank you.
All right, good. Thank you. I appreciate your time. Thanks, Tex.
Thanks for making time for Monopoly Watch. Thank you.
Members, our final submission for the day is Justice and Peace Commission, Catholic Diocese of Auckland, Peter Garrick. And Peter will be online, I expect. Yep. Yeah. Very broad, yeah.
And unmute. To do the unmute. Hi there now.
Now we can hear you. Welcome. Welcome to the committee.
Yeah.
I see we have Peter there and someone else.
Elliott. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. Welcome to both of you. You have up to 15 minutes for your submission. Members will no doubt have questions, so if you could leave some time, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
I'm Peter Garrick, Executive Secretary of the Justice and Peace Commission of the Catholic Diocese of Auckland, established to promote justice, peace and integral human development, particularly for the poor and marginalised in New Zealand society. And with me today is Lorraine Elliott, who's the Vicar for Social Impact and Communication for the Diocese, and she comes with extensive experience in health and social welfare, particularly for Maori.
Koutou. Katoa. Our presentation today is based on the recognition of the human dignity and right to protection of all members of society, particularly the most vulnerable. The decision to all the Commerce Commission study released on March 8 showed that the major grocery retailers were earning excess profits of around $1 million a day. We think that without regulation, families will continue to be hostage to unfair prices for food and other basics. This would be particularly the case for Maori and Pacifica communities where food makes up such a major part of the family budget. Urgent action is needed in these areas. We are very supportive of the intention of this bill to prevent supermarkets putting restrictive covenants on land to block competitors to set up shop and provide competitive choice for customers.
Like the slow train wreck of the housing crisis, this duopoly has been allowed to occur over the last 20 years under the unwatchful eyes of government administrations of different political stripes. The government is now on the back foot trying to repair the damage. This bill is a helpful first step, but it needs to be carefully framed. And we support the suggestions in the submission by the New Zealand Food and Grocery Council to strengthen the bill by three areas. Firstly, framing the prohibition on the anti-competitive covenants more broadly so that other forms of retail do not continue to suffer. And a previous speaker has stated this so eloquently. Secondly, ensuring lease agreements that feature various types of rights of first refusal don't hinder the lease of the land to another supermarket or food distributor without significant penalty. And thirdly, ensuring supermarkets can't unreasonably delay new developments by endlessly raising objections by resource to the district plan or the Resource Management Act. But like the current housing crisis, alleviating the exploitation of consumers by the present supermarket duopoly won't be an easy fix. It will take determined, careful effort on many fronts in order to make a difference.
It is encouraging that the government has finally made a start with this very helpful first step. Our families, who are the victims of this abuse of market power, require decision and effective action, hopefully with bipartisan support. I work with these families on a daily basis through Catholic Social Services in South Auckland and know how much harder it is now to put food on the table. As a compassionate society who care about the most vulnerable in our midst, we owe it to all of them to act firmly and decisively to support, to stop this exploitation, not support, stop.
As we point out in our written submission, we urge the government to also prepare legislation that will establish a dedicated regulator for the grocery sector, which will be charged with ensuring access to wholesale grocery items for new grocery chains. Secondly, establishing an enforceable code of conduct between major retailers and suppliers to prevent exploitation of in this area, as we pointed out in our written submission in a bit more detail. And thirdly, facilitating planning regulations about supermarket development, so that developments are not endlessly delayed, as I mentioned earlier. So that's basically our submission for today. We thank the Select Committee for the chance to speak, and for your convenience, I'll email through what we've said, and we're very happy to answer any questions.
Right, I might start while others are gathering their thoughts. You mentioned there about the duopoly at times stopping resource consents or slowing down resource consents, probably more accurate, I think, sort of what you touched on. We heard from a previous submitter around supermarkets at times requiring their landlord to campaign on their behalf and, campaign to council in terms of, other competitors not coming in. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that in terms of terms of linking to what you said before about the resource consents as an example?
Well, I can't really elaborate too much on that. It's just we've had experience with the supermarkets when we were doing submissions to the Auckland Council on the establishing a local alcohol policy, and endless work was done, and people put in submissions, and the supermarkets were just experts at just picking objections and delaying and delaying and delaying and delaying. And so now, even now, some 5 years later, we still don't have a local alcohol policy in Auckland, and that's tearing families apart. So that was really in that context.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
That's an example of how they can delay things for their own benefit. And so we're thinking you have to be design this legislation very carefully so that those loopholes aren't in there that they can exploit.
The duopoly, they have huge pockets, large pockets. I'll say that they don't, but they do. Whereas organisations such as ours and other organisations don't have large pockets, and they don't, have dedicated teams specifically protecting their entities.
I understand. Any questions?
No, it's good submission.
No? Yeah.
Good submission. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll now move back to private.